Joyeuse Noël. One Saturday morning during my junior year of high school, I showed up at the University of California at Irvine to compete in an impromptu speech contest sponsored by the Alliance Française, a French language school. I, along with a few dozen college and high school students, was given 1 hour to prepare a speech in French entitled Responsibility Toward Technology. The first prize was 2 months at the Alliance Française in Paris. I had been taking French since 7th grade, and under the tutelage of my high school teacher, Mr. Pokinghorn, affectionately known as Le Poke, I had become quite fluent. My fellow high school students often asked me how I had managed to learn the language so quickly. I always told them that it had something to do with my inability to do a cartwheel, shoot a basket, or roller skate. God had to compensate somehow. To qualify for the contest, all participants had to sign a statement saying that they had never spent more than 2 weeks in a French-speaking country and that neither parent was a native speaker. My parents' French was limited to a handful of words that had crept into Persian, including mini-jupe, mini-skirt, bigoudi, hair roller, abat-jour, lampshade, and coup d'etat. The French word most commonly used in Iran was chic, a word that accurately described what we were not. The only language heard in our house besides Persian was Shushtari, a version of Old Persian spoken by my father and his family, whose ancestors came from the historic city of Shushtar in southern Iran. About 1,750 years ago, King Shapur I led the Persians in a fight against the Roman Emperor Valerian. After winning the battle, the Persians brought the captured Roman engineers to Shushtar to design dams, water mills, artificial canals, and an irrigation system, many of which still work today. If Walt Disney had ever seen Shushtar, he would have created ancient land to be nestled alongside Frontierland and Fantasyland. The language of Shushtari, with its abundance of animal and plant imagery, reflects the simple agricultural life of its residents. Many words exist in Shushtari that do not exist in Persian. For instance, the word peshkel means animal droppings that are round like a goat's or sheep's. When two people look alike, my Aunt Sadiqa describes them as being like two halves of a peshkel. And to reveal what is truly valuable in life, my Aunt Fatimeh always uses the Shushtari proverb, "Any gift from a true friend is valuable, even if it's a hollow walnut shell." It's fair to say that the Shushtari floating in my house did not give me any edge in the French language. It did, however, teach me that people sometimes talk louder and laugh harder in their native tongue, as evidenced by my father and his siblings. It also trained my ear for accents and thus eventually got me into trouble. Even though I was the youngest contestant in the impromptu speech contest, I placed first. Unbeknownst to me, this was met with suspicion. Apparently, some people thought that my Parisian accent was too authentic for a foreigner. Perhaps taking their cue from Detective Clouseau, a couple of the judges decided to do a little investigative work. After the contest, my parents started receiving phone calls in French. They became a somewhat regular, although inexplicable, part of our lives. The phone would ring, and then my father or mother would say, "Wait, please, Firouzeh." I would pick up the receiver to find somebody from the Alliance Française with a piddling question or comment. "I would like to verify the spelling of your last name. I would like to congratulate you personally. Have you read anything by Camus? He's quite good." These French phone calls made my already nervous parents even more anxious. Why do they keep speaking French with us if they know we don't speak the language? They always asked me. I had no clue. I just assumed they were forgetful. My mother finally reached her own conclusion. "Nobody understands their English," concluded my mother, "and they know that." 2 weeks after my 17th birthday, I was on an airplane bound for Paris. I was scheduled to arrive 2 days before the national celebration of the French Revolution, Bastille Day. I had never been so excited in my entire life. I couldn't wait to meet my host family. I couldn't wait to eat an authentic baguette. I couldn't wait to make French friends. This was going to be the best summer of my entire life, the kind of summer that somebody would want to make a movie out of. And as soon as I set foot in the Paris airport, I was whisked away by 2 gendarmes. I had no idea that traveling with an Iranian passport would qualify me for special treatment. These men found it odd that 3 years after the revolution, a 17-year-old Iranian should be traveling by herself and staying in Paris for 2 months. In a small, windowless room, I explained to them in French, but with a perky Southern California demeanor, all about the contest and how I had won and how much I was looking forward to seeing the Louvre and going to cafes and eating a crepe on a street corner. "You don't know anybody in Paris?" they asked me. "Did anyone give you any materials to distribute? How is it that you speak French so well if you are only a student of French? Do you plan on returning to America afterward?" These people clearly thought my life was a lot more exciting than it was. After answering all their questions, I had to endure the luggage search. My suitcase, roughly the size of a coffin, was on loan from Aunt Sedire. It had previously been used to transport 2 large Persian rugs and an entire samovar set from Iran. The gendarmes started sifting through the clothes and the myriad of gifts I had brought for my host family. When they reached the stuffed Minnie Mouse, they decided they had had enough. They zipped up my suitcase and politely wished me a nice stay. After my rendezvous with the welcoming committee, I searched the airport for someone carrying a sign with my name on it. Once I found her, I was greeted with, "Where have you been?" I explained to her that I was a VIP, a very Iranian person, and things just take longer for us. Before coming to Paris, I had corresponded once with my host family, mainly to find out what kinds of gifts to bring. Michel and Christiane were journalists working for Libération, a left-leaning newspaper. They also had a 6-month-old daughter. I had envisioned myself spending evenings having enlightening discussions over home-cooked French meals. Pass the béarnaise sauce, please, and tell me again, Michel, what do you really think of the ramifications of industrialism in 19th century France? Upon arriving, I gave them the gifts: the coffee table book on California, the signed limited edition print of the Ferris wheel on Balboa Island, the T-shirts from Newport Beach, the homemade chocolate chip cookies, the homemade baklava, and the large Minnie Mouse. Once my hosts had opened all the presents, Christiane blithely informed me that the next morning they would be leaving for the countryside, where they would be staying for the entire summer, but here were the keys to the apartment. She also told me the location of the nearest 24-hour market. I then did what any self-respecting person would do. I asked to go with them. "Non," replied Christiane. It became painfully obvious to me that there was to be no cultural exchange with these people. The only exchange they were interested in was the exchange of currency between them and the rental office. Michel and Christiane's small apartment on the Rue de Turbigo was filled with books and magazines. Bookshelves lined every room. From Japanese art to Russian literature to the works of Dante and Joyce, every topic was covered, except, of course, hospitality. Had I not met Michel and Christiane, but simply stayed in their apartment, I probably would have liked them. The tiny bathroom came with a 3-year stack of Zoom, a photography magazine that prominently featured breasts in every pictorial, but in an intellectual way. For a spread on the disappearing tribes of Africa, the locals were featured alongside a lineup of topless Caucasian models wearing African masks. What better way to showcase the wildflowers of Provence than by painting a few topless models purple and placing them among the flowers? Even the ads followed the same theme. In a coffee ad, A dark-skinned model was featured sitting on a hill of beans. Both the beans and the model were naked. During my years as a French student, every textbook I had ever read had elaborated upon the unforgettable jubilance known as Bastille Day, the parade down the Champs-Élysées, the fireworks, the general merriment, and the cherished memories born only of this event. Sitting alone in the apartment the day after my arrival, I realized that I was going to be spending this momentous holiday by myself in a tiny apartment far away from the festivities. Since I knew nobody in Paris, I decided to go talk to the concierge to see if she had any ideas. According to my books on French culture, concierges were usually old ladies living alone on the ground floor of apartment buildings. They were usually pictured peeking from behind their lace curtains to see the comings and goings of the apartment dwellers. One is supposed to consult the concierge about the mail or a lost key, never for social advice, but I was desperate. I knocked on the door and was pleasantly surprised to be greeted by Noëlle, a plump, jovial woman in her early 40s. I explained to her that I had just arrived in Paris from California and was looking for something to do on Bastille Day. The minute she heard the word California, she perked up even more. "Une Californienne!" she exclaimed. I didn't really want to disappoint her by pointing out that I was actually une Iranienne, so I just smiled. She wanted to know whether I lived near Hollywood and whether I knew any famous people. I explained to her that I lived an hour away from Hollywood. As for famous people, I thought of telling her that my father is directly descended from the Prophet Muhammad, but I knew that wasn't the kind of famous person she was inquiring about. Noëlle told me to meet her the following night so we could go to the Champs-Élysées together. She said she couldn't wait. Neither could I. The next evening, I put on a Hawaiian shirt, jeans, and the spanking new Adidas sneakers I had bought for my trip. I knocked on Noëlle's door, but the woman who answered bore no resemblance to the concierge I had met the night before. Noëlle was clad in a body-hugging red knit dress that accentuated her ample curves. The plunging neckline barely covered her enormous chest. With each breath she took, I expected her bosom to just break free and come out to watch the parade with us. We started walking the 3 blocks to the metro station, catching the attention of every creepy male in the city of lights. As Noëlle jiggled and wiggled down the street, I thought of just skipping the parade since we had managed to start our own. During the long metro ride, we sat surrounded by the kind of men I always associate with windowless vans, bearing bumper stickers that say, "If this van's a rockin', don't come a knockin'." Unlike me, Noëlle was completely enamored of the attention, although to her credit, she never talked to any of the men. She was too busy inquiring about California, and specifically California men. In search of a husband, she told me, she had recently moved to Paris from the countryside, but she was hugely disappointed with the men. According to her, they were all married. I was surprised that she had any minimum standards, since her dress and high heels gave the impression that anyone in possession of a simple set of one X and one Y chromosome would suffice. We reached the Champs-Élysées approximately 10 minutes after the rest of the population of Western Europe. Noëlle and I moved around trying to find a good spot, but no matter where we went, all we could see was the backs of people's heads. I didn't think anything could be worse than the after-Christmas sale at Nordstrom, but I was clearly wrong. The parade started and ended. I saw nothing. Once the festivities were over, Noëlle and I made our way to the metro station, only to find that the same 14 rows of people who had been ahead of us at the parade were now ahead of us in line for the train. "Pas de problème," chirped Noëlle. "Nous chercherons un taxi." The idea of looking for a taxi was a fine one, except that apparently all the drivers had taken the night off. They'd probably been standing in front of us at the parade. After walking half a dozen blocks, Noëlle suggested that we just walk the rest of the way home. It was 1 a.m. Normally, I cannot stay awake past 10 o'clock. My goal throughout high school was to stay up long enough to watch Saturday Night Live. I never made it. In college, my parents had no need to worry about my getting involved with drugs and alcohol, since by the time most parties started, I was in my third cycle of REM sleep. I am also legendary among my friends for my complete lack of a sense of direction, making me the perfect kidnap victim, no blindfold necessary. Drive me anywhere and I will be unable to find my way back. It was therefore a great irony that I found myself in a foreign city trying to make my way home way past my bedtime. I spent the entire walk home making deals with God. If you just get me home, I will never ask for anything again. Between conversations with the Almighty, I listened for the click-click of Noel's heels, a Morse code of sorts, to guide me back to the Rue de Turbigo. By then, we had run out of conversation, or rather, Noelle had nothing more to say about men. Much to her disappointment, I didn't have much to contribute on the topic, since I was, to put it kindly, a late bloomer. School started a few days later. The classes, like the Bastille Day parade, were a huge disappointment. All my teachers were in their early 20s, and none seemed very interested in teaching. Perhaps they resented being stuck in Paris during the summer, a season when the French normally evacuate the capital. One teacher spent the whole time flirting with the men in class while completely ignoring the women. Another made us translate the lyrics of the works of Jacques Brel, a famous performer whose songs would have been appropriate for Suicide, the musical. We spent hours plodding through the songs while our teacher sat with a far-off look in her eyes. My English versions did not do them justice, but then again, the teacher had a certain hands-off style of teaching, a style that translated into her sitting in the corner, recalling perhaps a summer spent elsewhere. She helped us only reluctantly, as when none of our dictionaries had the word putain, slang for prostitute. With apologies to Monsieur Brel, the song, Jeff. No, Jeff, you're not alone. Stop crying like that in front of everyone because a fake blonde dumped you yet again. No, Jeff, you're not alone. But I'm ashamed to see you cry shamelessly in front of everybody because a 3/4 whore popped out of your life. Then we moved on to Fernande, a funerary march. To think that Fernande is dead, to think that Fernande has died, to think that I'm the only one behind, to think that he's the only one in front. Him in his last beer, me in my fog, him in his hearse, me in my desert. By the end of that song, we were able to conjugate the verb to die in every tense. Had I made some friends during my melancholic French lessons, I would have at least been a few degrees happier than Jeff or Fernande. Unfortunately, the students in my classes were quite a bit older than I was, and most were newly arrived immigrants struggling to learn French. These were not people hoping to find Gertrude Stein's favorite haunt. They were hoping to find a job. The few interesting people I did meet were leaving in 3 days to go somewhere else. No one, except for the people selling keychains under the Eiffel Tower, actually stayed in Paris during the summer. The upside of my lonely 2 months was that I became completely fluent in French. Having loads of free time, I also managed to see just about every museum in the city. Whatever culture I lacked after having spent 6 years in Southern California, I more than made up for. The downside of my summer was realizing that maybe the joys of being 17, even in Paris, were highly exaggerated. I wondered if the summer somehow foreshadowed the rest of my life. Maybe I was doomed to a really lonely existence, where the only pleasure came not from human company, but from croissants. Maybe someday I would end up thinking Jacques Brel's lyrics were uplifting. A few months after my return to California, I received a letter from Noelle letting me know that she had moved to New Caledonia, where, according to her, the ratio of men to women was 5-1. I remembered her kindness in taking me to the Champs-Élysées on Bastille Day to fulfill one of my dreams. Granted, she had mistaken me for a real Californian, someone who perhaps knew Paul Newman or Cher. But in exchange for making one of my dreams come true, I sincerely hoped that she would find Monsieur Merveilleux waiting for her on that little island in the Pacific. If someone were to make a movie of my summer in Paris, it would not be the touching coming-of-age film I had hoped for, but rather a black and white filled with close-ups of furrowed brows and croissant crumbs. There would be no theme song, just the sound of the metro doors opening and closing and opening and closing. Against this backdrop of teenage angst, there would have to be a symbol, a representation of the confidence that comes with eventual intellectual and spiritual growth. This would, bien sûr, be most effectively depicted by the judicious scattering of topless models in the background. The wedding. My marriage started out with a big, fat lie. I told my parents that François' family was happy about our engagement. I had to. In the Iranian culture, fathers will consent to a marriage only if the future groom and his family worship the bride. There is no getting around this detail. If there's any problem with the groom's family, forget it. Engagement off, moving on to the next suitor. When I first started dating François, his mother declared that I would never be allowed to set foot in her house. This was before she met me. Before meeting me, François had a long-time French girlfriend. From all accounts, she was an intelligent and capable person, but she was Jewish. Her religion was a problem until François started dating me. Compared to a Muslim, the Jewish girlfriend didn't seem so bad after all. I once asked François if there was anybody he could have dated that would have bothered his mother more. Well, he said, a black communist bisexual would have really irked her. My parents had a completely different reaction to François. They first heard of him during the summer after my junior year in college, 6 months after we had met. For 5.5 of those months, François and I had known we were going to get married, but had not said anything to our parents. I had simply informed my parents that I was dating somebody, and I wanted them to meet him. Dating, like the rodeo circuit or trout farming, is a completely foreign concept to my parents. They, like all their sisters and brothers, never dated, their marriages having been arranged by family members. My mother learned what she knows about dating from Days of Our Lives, especially Hope and Beau's tumultuous relationship. The only dates my father knew about contained pits. The first time they met François, my parents insisted on taking him to the nicest Persian restaurant in Los Angeles. My father ordered the appetizer sampler, which François ate with gusto while questioning my mother about the ingredients. Is this spiced sumac? Are these the thin-skinned Persian cucumbers? Is the feta made with sheep's milk? Once the appetizers were finished, François selected the most copious dish on the menu, the sultani, a combination of lamb, beef, and chicken kebab on an enormous mound of rice. His order arrived, looking as though someone had just grilled an entire petting zoo. François ate and ate and ate. My father asked me, in Persian, whether he always ate like this. My mother said, in Persian, that she hoped he wasn't going to get sick. Meanwhile, François kept eating. By the time he was done, there was not a grain of rice left on his large oval plate. My mother told him how lucky he was that he could eat enough food for 3 people and not be fat. François was of normal weight, although he did outweigh me, which fulfilled one of 2 requirements for dating a guy. The other requirement was a total lack of interest in watching sports on television. François fulfilled that one too. Unbelievably, he ordered dessert, exclaiming that he couldn't possibly imagine skipping the rosewater and pistachio ice cream. By then, I was just hoping that if he did throw up, it wouldn't happen in my father's car. Once we arrived at my house, I asked François why he had eaten so much. I know that Middle Easterners love to feed people, and I wanted to make a good impression on your parents, he said, but I need to go lie down now. My parents did like François, not because of his appetite for Persian food, but because he was kind and because I was in love with him. My mother had always hoped that I would marry an Iranian doctor, someone whom she could speak to without an interpreter, a man whose parents would consider me the best thing that had ever happened to their son. She had held steadfastly to her dream, thinking that as soon as I reached my late teens, I would become the Iranian daughter whom she could relate to, the daughter who would dutifully let her parents help her select a mate. Ever since we came to America, I had regarded my mother as a mere source of entertainment. This was a woman whose English required translation into English, a woman who listed the Gordines in her phone book under N for neighbor, but who listed her hairdresser, Patricia, under A, so her number would be on the first page. She had attended one PTA meeting during my entire educational career and had not understood a single word. Whenever I was required to bring a snack for some club meeting, my mother always wanted to make feta cheese and basil rolled in flatbread, or cholézard, a neon yellow dessert made with saffron. Forget it, I always told her, wishing she could just figure out how to make oatmeal raisin cookies. My mother was, in American adolescent vernacular, out of it. Perhaps the people we think we know the best are the ones who surprise us most. Once my mother realized that I wanted to marry François, she said, "He will be like a third son to me," and wiped the tears off her face. At that very moment, my mother threw aside everything she and her generation knew about marriage and entered a new world where daughters select their own husbands. She became a pioneer. My father was just happy that I was getting married. Having only one daughter, he was particularly pleased that François asked his permission to marry me. François later told me that while delivering his "please take good care of my daughter" speech, my father kept trying on my engagement ring on his own finger. "I just made sure he knew I wasn't proposing to him," François reported. As soon as our wedding plans became official, we started making the guest list. Despite initial misgivings, François' parents decided to attend. François' sister number 2 also agreed to come to the wedding. His maternal grandmother, whom he adored and considered to be his biggest influence, decided not to attend. François' oldest sister declined to come, stating that there was no way she would be in the same room as her mother or sister number 2. Brother-in-law number 1, whom François had known since the age of 7, declined to come, stating that having been virtually disinherited by his in-laws, he could not possibly attend. Brother-in-law number 2 declined to come, probably because there just isn't enough Mylanta in the world. François' only maternal aunt was not invited because she and my mother-in-law had fought over some land in Greece 20 years ago and were not on speaking terms. None of his 4 maternal cousins was invited, and I never asked why. I doubt they would have attended anyway. His paternal aunt and uncle declined to attend, as did their adult children. François' paternal grandmother did decide to attend, enlarging François' side of the wedding party to a whopping 4 family members. In contrast to François' family, mine were busy making plans for a joyous occasion. My parents, like Santa Claus, were faced with a long list of names. This was the first wedding among my siblings, and my parents could not possibly fathom leaving anybody out. The reception hall had a maximum capacity of 165, which is a problem when just the aunts, uncles, cousins, and second cousins add up to 98 people. My parents agonized over the guest list, recalling every one of their friends back in Abaddon. "We can't possibly leave them out," became a regular refrain. I didn't know half the people on the list. Who are the Abbasis and why are we inviting them? I wanted to know. They invited us to their daughter's wedding last year. Plus, they live in Australia. They won't come. They came, and they brought a niece with them. On a dozen occasions, invitations addressed to Mr. and Mrs. came back announcing that 6 people would be attending. Since our wedding was taking place in the summer, our guests, who themselves had house guests, decided to just bring them along. We invited 140 people. 163 accepted. 181 showed up. François and I had agreed that we would be married both in the Catholic Church and in a traditional Persian ceremony. The tough part was finding a Catholic priest who would be willing to officiate at a mixed marriage. François called several churches but was told that he would have to go to the church where he was a member. François had attended church a handful of times in his entire life. He was as Catholic as I was Muslim. I decided to try contacting the Catholic Church in my neighborhood in Newport Beach. I called and told the priest that my future husband was French, but we hoped to get married in Southern California, where my family lived. I told him that of course I had never attended church because I was Muslim, but if I were Catholic, I would have attended his church since it was my neighborhood Catholic church. Well, he said. I continued, I'm a very decent person. I could be Catholic, Jewish, you name it. All religions basically say the same thing, and I would just fit right in any of them. Well, that's not exactly, he said. What I mean is that they all work toward the same goal, I interrupted. Maybe he knew no other way to end the conversation, but the priest agreed to meet with me. Father Christopher turned out to be a kind and enlightened man with a wonderful sense of humor. He agreed to marry us, although our wedding would not include the communion. It was sort of a Catholic ceremony light. We had to meet with them a dozen times to discuss married life and religion. We also had to attend a retreat held at a convent, which was aimed at preparing us for the challenges of marriage. On the first day, one of the speakers mentioned a seminar about the unique challenges faced by mixed marriages. I attended, but found out that the mixed marriages he referred to did not involve Jews or Muslims, but rather Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and others who still believe in Jesus Christ, but with a different set of details. Planning the Persian ceremony, or Aqd, was by far the simplest part of our wedding. Ever since immigrating to America, my Aunt Sadiqeh and Uncle Abdullah had earned a living by translating official documents and serving as notary publics. Uncle Abdullah also officiated at Aqd ceremonies, a job that allowed him to utilize his in-depth knowledge of Arabic and the Quran. More important, this job meant that Aunt Sadiqeh had the scoop on every impending marriage for miles around. The Aqd ceremony is traditionally held at the bride's house and is limited to family members and close friends. Our guests also included my second-grade teacher, Mrs. Sandberg. Since my parents' condominium was too small, my Uncle Ali and Aunt Linda kindly allowed us the use of their house. This was a fitting choice because Uncle Ali was the first person in my family to marry a non-Iranian. He had met Linda, a blonde nurse, when he was a medical resident in America. Initially, there was much concern about his choice. Although none of us had ever met Linda, obviously, she did not know how to make Persian food. What would become of my Uncle Ali? Could an Iranian man survive life without basmati rice and lamb stew? Not only did Linda become a fabulous Persian cook, she also learned Italian cooking and became the quintessential hostess. She accomplished this while being employed full-time helping Ali run his medical practice. Now the family wonders what my uncle would have ever done without her. He got lucky, they all agree. In preparing for the Aqd, we needed a sofre, which is traditionally a hand-sewn cloth, roughly the size of a queen-size bedspread, on which the family arranges foods and objects, all of which hold special meaning. At the head of the sofre are the mirror and candle holders, symbolizing purity and love. Iranian families pass these objects from generation to generation. My father, the hopeless romantic, sold theirs after they were married. This was shortly before he decided to sell my mother's wedding band so they could stay at the Caspian Sea for an extra week. We ended up renting the sofre, the mirror, and the candle holders from an Iranian woman who does a brisk business providing the apparatus for Aqd ceremonies. For many Iranians, moving to America meant having to leave the large mirror and candelabrum set back home. Thus, a unique rental business was born. The sofre also holds an assortment of sweets, sugar-coated almonds, baklava, almond cookies, and rice cookies. All the sweets were prepared by Aunt Dordune, who is technically not my aunt. She is my cousin Mortaza's wife's aunt. But she has baked her way into everybody's heart, including my husband's, who also calls her khale, aunt. The week before my wedding, she showed up at our house every day and held marathon baking sessions, filling our house with the aroma of rose water, butter, and roasted nuts. In addition to the sweets, there was also a basket of almonds and walnuts, representing fertility, and a bowl of honey for a sweet life. A platter of feta cheese and herbs and flatbread represented happiness and prosperity. Finally, we had a small wooden tree with carved radishes placed on the tip of each branch, which didn't represent anything but looked cute. The ceremony began with François and me sitting facing the mirror with everybody crowding around the sofre trying to get a good view. Uncle Abdullah began his speech in Persian, read passages from the Quran in Arabic, then translated everything into English. While he was doing his part, several aunts and female cousins held a small cloth over our heads and rubbed 2 sugar loaves together. This is supposed to ensure the raining of happiness into the couple's life. When we were finally asked whether we wanted to marry each other, the groom is supposed to answer yes right away, but the bride is expected to take her sweet time and cause a little bit of last-minute anxiety for the groom and his family. When my uncle asked whether I wanted to marry François, I said nothing. My family yelled the traditional response, "She has gone to pick flowers." My uncle repeated his question. Again, I said nothing. The family yelled, "She has gone to bring rose water." My uncle asked a 3rd time. This time, I said yes. Everyone cheered as my uncle declared us husband and wife. When I call my parents at home, I usually speak to my mother first. When I ask to speak to my father, I often hear him yell in the background, "Tell her I've gone to pick flowers." If I happen to be in a hurry, I'll tell my mother to ask him to stop his nonsense and pick up the phone. Then I hear him say, "Tell her I've gone to get some rose water." He finds this very amusing. After the act was over, everybody hugged and kissed, then hugged and kissed some more. This was followed by everybody taking pictures and everybody crowding into everybody else's picture. The picture taking went on for a couple of hours, during which François complained that his face hurt from having to smile so much. And he added, "I've never been kissed by so many people in one day." It's difficult to separate Iranians from their tradition of endlessly hugging and kissing on both cheeks. Women kiss women, men kiss women, and big, hairy men kiss other burly men. Foreigners, especially men, tend to find this tradition a bit disconcerting. Since the French also kiss twice on the cheek, François was not completely frightened by the throng of relatives waiting to give him a peck. He did, however, complain about certain relatives whose pecks were a little juicier than he would have liked. I've known Americans who, unaware of the kissing ritual, have wanted to run for the nearest exit at the sight of a puckering Iranian uncle approaching with open arms. Even after my church ceremony, when everyone is supposed to leave the church quietly and in order, my relatives broke into a major kissing ceremony, making us look as if we had never been to a church wedding before, which was true. The most difficult part of my wedding was finding a location for the reception. Iranian weddings usually start at 10 p.m. and end at 2 a.m. This eliminates all clubs and outdoor venues. Iranian food must be served. This eliminates all hotels, which make most of their money from their own catering. We had a small budget. This eliminated all locations with landscaping or English-speaking employees. Our reception ended up in an Indian-Chinese restaurant near the airport. The business had started out as an Indian restaurant, but sales had been slow. Showing true immigrant tenacity, the owners added Chinese items as well. This was a place where one could order tandoori chicken or crab foo young, lentil soup or fishball soup, and where the condiments included both soy sauce and chutney. The restaurant reminded me of a Pakistani rug shop I know in Northern California, which in addition to carpets started selling used computer parts and eventually added falafel. I assume, given a few years, leg waxing will also be a part of their repertoire. The manager of the restaurant was a large Indian man with an overhanging stomach. The big tummy worked on Buddha, but not on this guy. To add to his appeal, the whites of his eyes were the color of egg yolks and were further highlighted by being permanently bloodshot. This man could have easily been in Star Wars. The night of my wedding, he stood in front of the locked door to the restaurant and said, "I will only let you in if you give me an extra $400 in cash right now." With the guests arriving in an hour, my father, who is significantly smaller than the manager, didn't have many options. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, I did not hear about this until a few weeks after the fact. It's fair to say the brides yelling and screaming would not have made for the most memorable wedding day moment. Our reception was a typical Iranian party with lots of music, too much makeup, and great food. As François and I entered, everyone stood up and cheered. We went around to each table, receiving more hugs, kisses, and wishes for a happy future. Aunt Sadira followed us, throwing tiny, fake gold Persian coins over our heads. In ancient Persia, the gold would have been real. Everyone, even the busboys, knew the coins were fake. Everyone, that is, except for my new sister-in-law, who spent the evening feverishly collecting them. When it came time to eat, we were the first ones in line, followed by Father Christopher. "This is one reception I don't want to miss," he had told us. The meal consisted of the traditional sweet carrot rice with almonds, saffron, and chicken, lima bean rice with lamb shanks, eggplant stew, herb stew, stuffed grape leaves, and cucumber, tomato, and herb salad. My parents had also ordered an entire lamb to be roasted. The Persians, like the Romans and Greeks before them, believe in slaughtering a lamb when something good happens. This is supposed to ward off the evil eye. Marriages, job offers, new cars, and new babies are always accompanied by this ancient ritual. In Iran, families who cannot afford a lamb use a chicken. Wealthier families usually donate the meat to the poor. Iranians in America have had to tweak this tradition a bit. Slaughtering a lamb on one's front porch in Los Angeles might not do much for the neighborhood, so when something good happens that calls for a lamb slaughter, who you gonna call? Relatives in Iran, that's who. Lambs are now slaughtered long distance and distributed to the poor in Iran. Your son bought a Lexus? There goes a lamb. The grandson graduated from UCLA Law School? Don't forget the lamb. For my wedding, the Iranian caterer told us that for an extra $250, which in Iran buys an entire flock of sheep plus the sheep herder's wages, he would roast a lamb and present it as a centerpiece. My response was, "Oh God, no." But it's not like the bride's opinion stands a chance against tradition. With more fanfare than my own entrance got, the result was wheeled out at the beginning of dinner. François and I gasped. There on the cart was not a lamb, but a lamb carcass, all the meat having been already carved off. On top of its skull was a conical party hat, and where its eyes had once been sat a pair of sunglasses. This creature did not belong at a wedding, but on the cover of a Stephen King novel. Father Christopher announced that he was ready to perform the last rites, a perfectly funny Catholic joke wasted on this crowd. Dinner was followed by more dancing. The DJ played everything from Persian songs to top 40 hits to salsa. The dance floor remained full until the time came to throw the bouquet. This is not an Iranian tradition, but any ritual that might lead to finding a husband is quickly and readily adopted into my culture. With all eligible females holding their breath, I threw my bouquet, then turned around to see who the next bride would be. There, standing at my reception, at my wedding, was a complete stranger holding my bouquet of yellow orchids. As the photographer scrambled to take her picture, I found my mother to ask her who that was. "That's Sohela, the daughter of Mojda Khanum, who's babysitting your Aunt Zedi's grandkids tonight. She wants to get married, but she's really tall, so it's hard to find an Iranian husband. So your Aunt Zedi brought her thinking that she might meet someone at your wedding, although personally, I don't think so. She really is too tall." I could only hope that my wedding would work a bit of magic for this uninvited guest. I like to think that she eventually found a husband, a tall Iranian doctor maybe, or perhaps a short Mexican businessman with a big heart, or a medium-built Irish Catholic book vendor whose family thinks she's the best thing that ever happened to their son. But regardless of her husband's ethnicity, one thing's for sure. If she did get married, there are a couple fewer lambs in Iran. I feel the earth move under my feet. After getting married, François and I moved to San Francisco, where we rented an apartment on the top floor of a 4-story building. The building was a quiet one, and the tenants mainly kept to themselves. The second floor was populated entirely by old women living alone. Every morning, each of them would leave the building for a daily stroll, taking tenuous steps with the help of a walker or a caretaker. A month after moving into our apartment, I returned home from work early one day to take care of a few errands. I was about to get into the shower when the phone rang. I put on my bathrobe and answered the phone. It was someone from UPS returning my call regarding a wedding gift that had arrived broken. As I was trying to explain that no, I did not have a receipt for the gift, the room started to shake and rattle. The pictures, which François had just hung on the wall, crashed to the floor, sending broken glass everywhere. The kitchen cabinets burst open and glasses and dishes flew out, shattering on the tile floor. As disturbing as it is to hear the sound of just one glass shattering, I was now hearing dozens of glass objects breaking in every room at the same time. Having grown up in California, I had always heard about the big one, the inevitable huge earthquake that awaited all of us who chose to live in sunshine instead of reason. I assumed this was it. My first thought was that the building was going to fall. I considered putting on some clothes other than the terry cloth bathrobe I was wearing, but then I thought, who cares? The floor was covered with broken glass, so I grabbed the first pair of shoes I saw, François' bunny slippers. I also took a pillow to protect my head from falling debris. As I was about to leave the apartment, I thought of my parents. I had to call them. I picked up the phone, but the line was dead. This disturbed me more than the earthquake itself. My parents are highly evolved worriers. My mother once called me in the middle of the day to tell me to make sure I wear shoes when cleaning the attic because she had just heard about a woman who, while cleaning her attic barefoot, was bitten by a rare brown spider whose venom cut off the circulation to her extremities. Consequently, the woman's nose fell off. It was pointless for me to remind my mother that I do not have an attic. My parents do not limit themselves to worrying about things that have actually happened. Dreams are also fair game. I often get phone calls with detailed descriptions of a dream followed by, "So naturally, I had to call to make sure you were okay, and there wasn't a reason why I dreamed of you trapped in a canoe with a blue turtle." If worrying were an Olympic sport, my parents' faces would have graced the Wheaties box a long time ago. I tried the phone again, but it was still dead. I left my apartment and started walking down the stairs, holding the pillow on my head with both hands. The quake had activated the fire alarm, so the hallways were ringing. As I reached the second floor, I saw one of the old ladies standing in her doorway, shaking uncontrollably. Her face had no color. My first thought was that this person was about to have a heart attack. "Let's leave the building. There are probably going to be aftershocks," I told her. She just stared at me. I put my arms around her tiny, shaking body and started stroking her head. She was trembling like a little bird. In a thick Eastern European accent, she haltingly told me that she just wanted to go back to her apartment. Still holding and stroking her, I stepped into her apartment and sat down on the sofa. I told her that everything was okay and that we had nothing to worry about. I did not believe a word I was saying, but she apparently did. After a while, the color started slowly coming back into her face. I again suggested leaving the building, but she refused. By the time I decided to leave, she looked normal and was telling me how glad she was that her favorite lamp had not broken. Before stepping out of her apartment, I asked her if I could try using her phone. I picked up the phone and heard a dial tone. I called my parents and was greeted cheerfully by my father, who clearly had not heard about the earthquake. "Baba," I said, "there was a big earthquake, but I just wanted to let you know that I'm okay." "No problem," he answered cheerfully. "How's everything else?" My father was not grasping the gravity of the situation, and I had no idea how to describe the earthquake without the handy Richter scale number. "It was a big earthquake. Everything broke," I told him. "Don't worry," he said. "Things are replaceable." "Just know I'm okay," I said. "I gotta go." As soon as I hung up, I thought that I should also call my in-laws, who at the time were living in Marin County, 45 minutes from San Francisco. Ever since marrying François, I had clung to the notion that my mother-in-law, in a moment of enlightenment, would cast aside her prejudices and join François and me in celebrating our union. I imagined us preparing elaborate Christmas dinners together and her telling me for the 100th time how narrow-minded she had been before getting to know me. And for the 100th time, I would tell her that I forgave her. I dialed my in-law's number. My mother-in-law picked up the phone. I was pretty sure this would be the moment of bonding. It would go something like this. "Oh, dear Firuzeh, this earthquake shook me up and made me realize what a fool I've been. How could I have judged you because of your nationality? What was I thinking? Muslims, Jews, Catholics, we're all the same. Imagine it took me this long to wake up and see that we all laugh the same laughs and cry the same tears. Please forgive me." I got it almost right. My mother-in-law asked whether her china had broken. Before the wedding, François had discovered in his parents' garage 2 large boxes of Limoges china that had never been unpacked. François had never seen these dishes. He assumed they were yet another box of inherited dishes that his parents owned, but had never gotten around to using. He asked his mother whether he could have them. In a rare moment of generosity, she said yes. For weeks following the Loma Prieta earthquake, building inspectors measured the damage and labeled structures with green, yellow, or red stickers. Ours was given a yellow sticker, which, unlike a red sticker, meant that we could return to our homes. However, many repairs needed to be made. The elevator had to be fixed for the elderly residents, but otherwise, we didn't expect much. We had come to accept that our landlord's idea of maintenance was cashing the rent checks. One evening, a few weeks after the earthquake, there was a knock on our door. I opened the door, and standing there was the elderly lady I had met during the earthquake. She was holding a chocolate bundt cake. As soon as she saw me, she burst into tears. Handing me the cake, she took out a wad of tissue and said, "I just wanted to tell you." But she got no further. Her sobs got louder. "I just wanted to tell you," she said again, "that you saved my life. My name is Golda Rubenstein, and you saved my life." She continued to sob. I thanked her and told her that she had actually saved my parents' life since her phone was the only one working, and she didn't let me finish. "I just wanted to thank you and make sure you knew that you saved my life." I thanked her for the cake again and told her I was glad that she was fine. I also thanked her again for letting me use her phone. For a week after the earthquake, all the phones in our building had been dead. My parents later told me that after my phone call, they had turned on the news and seen the devastation. "Had it not been for your phone call," they always say, "we would have worried ourselves to death." Golda's was the only phone in the entire building that had been working. A month later, Golda made another surprise visit, this time bringing only half a chocolate bundt cake. Once again, I opened my door and she burst into tears. Handing me the cake, she took out a wad of tissue. In between sobs, she said, "I called my son and I says, Yaakov, an angel came to me. An angel saved my life." Listening to her own reenactment of the phone call, she sobbed louder. I thanked her for the cake and told her how grateful I was for what she had done for my parents, but she didn't want to hear any of it. Every month, like clockwork, Golda came to our door with half a chocolate bundt cake, a heart full of gratitude, and eyes full of tears. One time, when I wasn't home, she had encountered François and asked him whether he knew that he was married to an angel. She had also told him that he was too skinny and she was going to fatten him up. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I wasn't sure which, my mother-in-law's china had not broken. The earthquake did, however, make her rethink her impulsive burst of generosity. This did not surprise us. I would not be singing Kumbaya with this woman any time soon. As beautiful as they were, 2 words now described these dishes: bad karma. François wanted to give them back and forget the whole thing. I was willing to get rid of them, but I did not want to give them back to his mother. I also didn't want to sell them. I figured their bad karma would extend to any money that we made from them. A home for families of children undergoing long-term treatment at a nearby hospital was having a benefit auction. I contacted the organization. Were they interested in a 70-piece set of antique Limoges? They were. After the auction, we received a letter thanking us for our donation and informing us of the selling price. We were thrilled that somebody now owned a beautiful set of china that came with no strings attached. More important, we were happy to have helped out a family that was dealing with a gravely ill child. And if feeling good wasn't enough of a reward, we were now considered major donors to the organization. For the next few years, we were honored guests at a handful of dinners from major donors, all of which were held at elaborate homes where the paintings on the walls were not reproductions. These were catered events with valet parking. At the time, we owned one car, a Honda with a large ding on the side. I always suggested to François that perhaps we should park our car a few blocks away and walk. François refused, insisting that should he suddenly wake up and find himself a multimillionaire, he would like to think of himself as the type who wouldn't be a slave to status symbols, the type who would still remember the little people and the cars driven by the little people. Plus, he added, maybe the valets will get mixed up and give us a BMW. At these dinners, we met all sorts of people whose names graced museums and large institutions. These were people who had not had a financial worry in 3 generations. At age 26, François and I were by far the youngest guests. Knowing that our days at these swanky shindigs were numbered, we tried to make the most of them by trying each and every one of the desserts. We never did tell my mother-in-law about the china. She never accepted our marriage. Even the birth of our children did not soften her. We eventually stopped having contact with her. The Limoges set has brought us more joy in its absence than it ever did in our cupboards. Of course, we no longer own a set of china to pass down to our kids, but that's okay. François and I plan on giving our children something more valuable, the simple truth that the best way to go through life is to be a major donor of kindness. We'll tell them that it's possible to own a whole bunch of beautiful, valuable things and still be miserable. But sometimes, just having a recipe for chocolate bundt cake can make a person far, far happier. A nose by any other name. When I was a student at Berkeley, I found myself fascinated by a certain librarian there. This woman had the ugliest nose I had ever seen. It was as if God, in a moment of confusion, had switched her nose with the beak of an exotic bird. I suspected that somewhere deep in the rainforests of Brazil, high in a mango tree, lived a toucan with a human nose. What triggered my fascination wasn't the sheer majesty of the librarian's nose, but her abundant confidence. This woman carried herself like a beauty queen. As I watched her go about her duties in her self-assured manner, I couldn't help but wonder, why doesn't she have a complex? In Iranian culture, a woman's nose is much more than a breathing device. It is her destiny. A girl with an ugly nose learns early on to dream of one thing only, a skilled plastic surgeon. Only the poorest families do not intervene to correct nature's nasal missteps. No amount of charm, talent, or intelligence can make a girl overcome an ugly nose. It simply must be fixed. I am descended from 2 types of noses. On my father's side, the noses are big, but otherwise perfectly reasonable. God just didn't know when to stop a good thing. The noses in my maternal lineage are all large and hooked. Gonzo on Sesame Street bears an uncanny resemblance to my mother's side of the family. I grew up thinking that it was normal to yell, "Not the profile," whenever a picture was being taken. Mine is the kind of nose that enabled me to impress fellow high school students with my ability to balance a pencil and eraser between my nose and mouth. This enviable contortion act pretty much sealed my fate as the type of girl who never had to worry about buying a prom dress. When I was small, all eyes were on my nose. I was considered a cute little girl, but whenever anyone commented on my looks, someone, usually my mother, would say, "We'll see." Everyone knew what that meant. History is full of girls who were cute one day and then boom, the nose grew. And my female relatives had known them all. They continued their nose watch, tracking my rhinal growth like traders tracking stock on Wall Street. By the time I was an adolescent, it was clear that I had been somewhat spared. I had a hooked nose light. I resembled my maternal relatives, but the nose wasn't quite bad enough to invite comparison to a puppet. The consensus among my female relatives was that even though my nose wasn't horrific, it could use a little improvement. You just need the tip removed. When I was 18, my father and I headed off to a consultation with a plastic surgeon, the best in Newport Beach. As I sat in this man's well-appointed office and looked at the expansive ocean view, I wondered how he could take himself seriously. Judging by the framed diplomas all over the walls, he had spent many years studying at prestigious medical establishments. Here was somebody who could be saving a life somewhere, but instead he was looking forward to lopping off the tip of my nose. As he explained the procedure, what bothered me the most wasn't the idea of having my nose broken, but having my nose broken by him. I just didn't respect him enough. My father was relieved that I had decided against a nose job. He thought it was way too expensive. "You can buy me a car instead," I suggested. "Your nose is fine," he replied, "and you don't need a car." Despite the ominous warnings from my female relatives that noses keep growing well into adulthood, I managed to graduate from college, get married, and have children, all with my original nose. I hadn't actually thought about my nasal imperfections in years. After 2 pregnancies, I had found other body parts far worthier of obsession. I had, however, thought about the toucan. Whenever anyone complained about his nose, I always shared the story of the confident librarian who had overcome her formidable rhinal challenge. Naturally, people wanted to know why she had so much confidence. "I don't know, she just did," I always replied. Little did I dream that I would someday find out. About 20 years after my last sighting of the toucan, François and I and our 2 kids were on our way to a motel for a week. Our house was on the market, and the real estate agent felt that it would sell more quickly if we weren't in it. Somehow, toys scattered throughout the house and toilets that the little ones had forgotten to flush are not considered a marketing boon. François and I cleaned the house, removed all the extra things we had stuffed in our closets, put fresh vases full of flowers everywhere, and left. We arrived at the local motel just in time to go to bed. While we were putting the kids to sleep, François was called in to work. As soon as he left, every article I had ever read about crimes being committed in motel rooms came flooding back to me. I was convinced that the moment I fell asleep, a disgruntled ex-employee who had managed to keep the master key would come back to avenge himself. I was not going to be able to sleep until my husband returned. Desperate for a distraction, I turned on the TV. Since we don't have a television in our house, I assumed it would be fairly easy to find something entertaining, if only for the novelty. I started flipping channels, avoiding the in-depth profiles of serial murderers, zipping past the sitcoms, past the infomercials selling juicers, past Susan Lucci selling shampoo. Just as I was thinking, thank God I don't have a television so I don't have to watch this crap, all of a sudden, there she was on the screen, the toucan. She looked exactly the same, except for a few more gray hairs. I assumed that this was a show about the Dewey Decimal System or recent donations to the UC Berkeley Library. But suddenly, the camera panned back, and I saw that the toucan was completely naked. My father had always told me that a college education would give me endless opportunities. I never realized that seeing the librarians naked would be one of them. I was intrigued and repulsed at the same time. I looked to make sure my children were sleeping. They were still at the age when they readily announced every detail of our life to perfect strangers. Mommy watches naked women on television might not get them into the best preschools. I hoped that Francois would not come home and think I was hiding some big secret. I sat back to watch the interview, more awake now than before. The naked toucan had startled me more than any axe-wielding, disgruntled ex-employee. According to the interview, the toucan was a member of a nudist colony in Northern California. This in-depth profile covered not only her experiences as a nudist, but also the experiences of the other nudists. The toucan talked extensively about coming to accept herself as she is. She didn't refer to her nose, but that's what I was thinking about. She said that she had struggled with low self-esteem her whole life until she discovered nudism. Somehow, she had shed her clothes and her poor self-image simultaneously, a concept that could truly put a dent in the world of cosmetic surgery. How odd, I thought, that I had so wondered about this woman's self-confidence, and my question was being answered on an obscure cable show in a cheap motel at midnight. The toucan continued listing the virtues of nudity, how being naked took away all pretenses and left others to see her for who she really was. I had always thought that conversation revealed who people really were, but apparently seeing their saggy body parts could actually tell me a whole lot more. The other members of the colony said basically the same thing as the toucan, although she was by far the most articulate, not to mention the best looking. Before this show, I had assumed that watching a group of naked people would be erotic in some way. Not this group. I was not the only one who had not gone to the prom. The show ended with a scene of all the nudists sitting around a campfire laughing and bonding. Watching this jovial group, I found myself overcome with sadness. I couldn't help but think of all the Iranian women who had paid to have their noses broken and reshaped just so someone might find them worthy of love. I thought of all the little girls I had known who had learned to cringe at their own reflections. I remembered how much I admired Jane Fonda's nose when I was in 4th grade in Tehran, and how much I hated my own. Thinking of all that wasted energy, I wanted to scream and tell my fellow countrymen and countrywomen that a nose by any other name is just a nose. It does not hold the soul, for no matter how big our noses may be, our souls are far, far bigger. My husband was quite surprised to find me awake at 2 a.m. when he returned from work. "What have you been doing?" he asked. "Watching television." "But you hate television," he reminded me. "Believe me," I said, "there are some interesting shows nowadays." Judges paid off. My brother Farsi travels frequently on business. Having accumulated enough mileage to travel to the moon and back, business class, he regularly treats family and friends to free trips to faraway lands. After our first year of marriage, he offered Francois and me tickets to the Bahamas, if we were interested. We were interested. The timing was perfect. Both Francois and I had just changed jobs, and we each had a 2-week break. Neither of us had ever been to the Bahamas, but how can you go wrong with white sandy beaches, warm water, and swaying palm trees? We landed in Nassau, where we had reservations for 2 nights. We had not made any further plans, choosing instead a more adventurous approach. "Let's get there and see which island beckons us," was our motto. There's a fine line between a sense of adventure and stupidity, and we had crossed that line. Once in Nassau, we discovered that there was no island beckoning us. We had arrived smack dab in the middle of spring break, and the Bahamas were full of people far more intelligent than we who had already made reservations on every boat or plane leaving Nassau for the other islands. We were stuck. Perhaps it is unfair to judge any place during spring break. After all, the students who flock to these resorts are generally not the brightest lights in the American galaxy. These are people for whom a vacation does not officially begin until they have thrown up a couple of times. It seems like such a waste for them to fly to the Bahamas, or anywhere else, since they can just as easily go to a motel in their own neck of the woods and simply pass out for a week. It would serve this country better if these types could have their passports stamped domestic travel only, thereby limiting the damage they do as national embarrassments. During our first night, we were kept up till dawn thanks to the drunken festivities taking place in all the rooms around us and in the hallway. We complained to the management. For $180 a night, we should be entitled to get some sleep. Sorry, they said. Hang loose. We spent the next day desperately trying to find a way to leave Nassau and the Spring Breakers, a locale that would have inspired Dante to add a 10th ring to his hell. Every bus, plane, and boat was full. We walked around town asking the locals if they had any idea how we could get to any of the islands. The locals all shook their heads, then asked us if we wanted to buy Coke. They weren't talking about the fizzy drink. By the end of the first day, I was ready to cry. I had seen no swaying palm trees, just swaying drunks. There was no sea life, just piles of beer-bloated students passed out on the beach. They did resemble groups of elephant seals from far away, but the travel brochure had shown dolphins. We returned to the hotel and asked the security guard whether he had any advice. He suggested we go to the post office and inquire about the mail boats that ferried goods from Nassau to the other islands. They were willing to take passengers, space permitting. We also asked him why the police didn't do anything about all the people trying to sell Coke on every corner. The police are often in on it, he told us. We have a lot of wealthy cops in the Bahamas. The guidebook that we had purchased in the States listed all the official mail boats. With guidebook in hand, we arrived at the post office and were told there was only one boat, the Spanish Rose, leaving during the next 2 weeks, and it was departing the next morning at 7. I immediately looked it up in my guidebook. It wasn't listed. It's not on the official list, I informed Francois. It's probably a drug boat. I'm not going. What do you think is going to happen? Francois asked. Will be next week's headlines. Dismembered bodies discovered, camera equipment missing. I am not going, I repeated. We stood arguing on the street corner for a while. Then Francois approached the policeman and asked him whether he had ever heard of a mail boat called the Spanish Rose. Of course, the policeman said enthusiastically. See, Francois said, are you convinced it's legitimate? I was shocked at the naivete of this Frenchman. The cop is in on it, I whispered. He probably lives in a big house on a hill with an ocean view. That's it, Francois said. I'm going to come here tomorrow morning at 6. You do what you want. I, however, will be boarding the boat. Fine, I said. The next morning, we showed up early and found a group of Bahamian families ready to board the Spanish Rose. It looked perfectly safe. Francois asked whether I was embarrassed by the previous day's display of paranoia. I don't recall, I said, doing my best imitation of a politician on trial. We boarded and found a spot among the crates of tomatoes, potatoes, and eggs, and several cages of live chickens. The boat ride was straight out of a Jacques Cousteau special. We passed by small islands with white beaches and swaying palm trees. The water, which was teeming with fish, changed colors from turquoise to jade to cobalt. Overhead, the cloudless sky presented us with yet another magnificent shade of blue. This was the Bahamas we had dreamed about. 4 hours later, we arrived at the island of Spanish Wells. Our guidebook mentioned only that this small island, inhabited by lobster fishermen, was named after the Spanish sailors who used to come ashore for fresh water. Excuse us, we asked the first person we saw at the dock. Can you tell us where to find a taxi? The old man looked us over. Where are you going? We'd like to find a hotel, we answered cheerfully. I'll give you a ride, he said. We put the suitcase in the trunk and buckled ourselves in. 30 seconds later, he announced, "Here we are." He refused to accept money, but he did tell us to come to his restaurant, where he served the best fried turtle on the islands. Francois's eyes lit up. Gross, I thought. I draw the line at any animal that features prominently in Aesop's fables. The receptionist asked us how long we were planning on staying. "About 10 nights," we said. She opened the large reservation book, running her forefinger down each page. She never said a word. She didn't look at us, just turned the pages slowly. That's it, I thought. They're booked full and we're stranded. Finally, she spoke. "This way," she said. The receptionist, who was also the bellhop, carried our bag to our room, then waited for a tip. We asked her whether the hotel was full. "All the rooms are vacant," she said. They remained that way during our entire stay. Our room was right on the white, sandy beach. The calm blue ocean filled the horizon. Except for a few palm trees, there was nothing else on the beach. We put down our bags and decided to go look for a place to eat. Walking up and down the island, we noticed that the streets were empty, no tourists, no locals. The atmosphere reminded me of a book I had read in junior high about a boy who was the only survivor of an atomic bomb and had to rely on his wits to survive. I couldn't remember anything else about the book, but I knew that if I had to rely on my wits to survive, I was far worse off than the turtles. We went back to our hotel, but the receptionist wasn't there. That was because she was now the waitress at the hotel's restaurant. We were seated after a few minutes and given menus with pictures of lobsters on them. "That's what I want," said François. "Sorry," said the receptionist bellhop waitress, "but it's not lobster season." We ordered conch chowder and sandwiches. The service was quite good, but then again, we were the only customers in the restaurant. The food, though, was unbelievably expensive. We later found out that this is because everything has to be brought to Spanish Wells by boat. A box of Cheerios at the island's grocery store, Pindar Market, cost $6.50. While we were eating lunch, the owner of the hotel, a British man, came to say hello. He was thrilled to see us, especially when he found out that we were staying for 10 days. He proceeded to tell us a few facts about the island, how, unlike other Bahamians, the inhabitants of Spanish Wells are all white, and how they work 6 months out of the year catching lobster, earning at least $100,000 per year. This did explain the number of satellite dishes we had seen on our walk. I asked the owner what he did before he moved to Spanish Wells. "Well," he said, "I worked somewhere you have never heard of." That's what I say whenever anybody asks me where I was born. "Where's that?" I asked him. "Abadan, Iran," he said. I had to hold myself back from an a cappella rendition of It's a Small World. It turns out not only did this man live in Abadan, he worked at the same company as my father, the National Iranian Oil Company. He knew my old neighborhood, the local clubhouse, and Alfie's, the general store where I bought all my tea sets. After lunch, we set out for a walk along the shore. Big, heavy conch shells littered the beach. "I know what I'm bringing back from this trip," I told François. "Just so you know," he said, "you collect it, you carry it home." We saw no other tourists on the island. François spent his days reading murder mysteries, while I schemed of ways to bring back my growing conch shell collection. Taking breaks from doing nothing, we went on long walks, discovering such unusual sights as a drug plane that had crashed years ago on its way from Colombia. Unfamiliar with the nuances of the cocaine trade, we had no idea that it was a drug plane when we first saw it. That evening, we were enlightened about its unique history by our receptionist bellhop waitress historian. Later, we returned to take pictures in front of its hollowed interior where the bags of cocaine had been stored. This was a classic example of travel brochures leaving out the best tidbits. During our walks, we also discovered the Pindar restaurant, the Pindar bakery, and the Pindar gas station. Back at the hotel, we asked the owner why most of the businesses were called Pindar. He took out the island's phone book. Almost everyone in the book, all 20 pages, was named Pindar. Apparently, the island had been settled by 2 families, the Pindar family and the Pindar family, and they had kids and made more Pindars, he added. Halfway through our stay, as we were eating yet another frighteningly expensive meal, the owner of the hotel approached our table, sat down, and asked us if we were enjoying our stay. His sudden interest in us made me think that he was about to ask us for something. It reminded me of when I was 6 years old, and Farsi would tell me what a wonderful sister I was, and then ask me to share my Kit Kat bar with him. Sure enough, the Englishman asked us whether we would be willing to do a favor for the people of Spanish Wells. Good God, I thought, drug smuggling. He continued, "Every year, the girls of Spanish Wells compete in a beauty pageant. It's the biggest event of the year, and every girl dreams of winning the title and qualifying for the Miss Bahamas pageant. The problem is that we can never find judges who are not related to the contestants since, as you've noticed, it's a small island. We were wondering if you two would do us the honor of serving as judges in this year's pageant." I hate beauty pageants. This may have to do with the fact that I was one of those girls who learn early on that they will have to rely on their brains to open doors. It took me years to overcome the beauty expectations of Iranian culture and a few more years to overcome growing up in Newport Beach, where the standard of beauty involves rigorous exercise, bottles of hydrogen peroxide, and silicone. There was no way I was going to dip my toe in the dysfunctional pond of beauty pageants. As if reading my mind, the Englishman continued, "It's not just about beauty. There's a talent competition and a question and answer segment. Please consider this, since otherwise we don't have enough judges." There wasn't much we could say. "We'll do it," we said. "Splendid," he exclaimed. The next morning, when the receptionist, bellhop, waitress, historian, maid came to clean the room, she greeted us with unusual enthusiasm. "So I heard you will be judging the pageant this year. I competed 3 times. "I thought you can only compete once in a beauty pageant," I said. "We don't have a lot of girls on the island, so you can keep trying." The following afternoon, hundreds of residents of Spanish Wells stood on the beach to watch the arrival of a small motorboat. I had not seen this many people since we landed. As the boat approached, I could see a woman wearing a purple hat with large purple feathers waving at everyone. The crowd went wild. As she gingerly stepped off the boat, we were told this was a former Miss Bahamas who had come to be a pageant judge. The 4th judge would be the son of a wealthy Canadian family that owned the large house on the island. The next night, Francois and I, the former Miss Bahamas, and the rich Canadian, who happened to be drunk, met with the pageant's organizer. She breathlessly explained that there would be a bathing suit competition, a talent competition, during which each girl would have to represent some aspect of life in the Bahamas, and a question and answer segment. This woman was so excited, it became obvious that the pageant was far more than just an entertainment. We were being asked to determine the course of the future for these young girls. I had always known that I would make a great god, but now that I had the opportunity, I wanted to run away. We were escorted to the pageant by the Englishman, who, like a fisherman bragging about his large catch, let everyone know he had reeled in 2 judges for the competition. The auditorium was packed with screaming people holding signs declaring their choice for the evening's winner. "Miss Spanish Wells equals Chantal!" Seated between the former Miss Bahamas and the rich, drunk Canadian, surrounded by screaming islanders, I could only hope that Pender Market sold antacid. I had the same dreadful feeling I'd had the last time I was strapped into a roller coaster, although at least that experience lasted only a few minutes. If this evening ever ended, I would be adding judging beauty pageants to my list of things never to try again, right under gymnastics classes and blood sausage. The MC got on stage and managed to quiet the crowd. He announced the names of the 6 girls competing for the title. 4 of them were Pinders. After each name, he had to pause a few minutes to let the cheering die down. At least if I ever compete in a pageant, my large, fertile Middle Eastern family will guarantee me a win for largest cheering section. The girls then all filed onto the stage, which led to more cheering and screaming and sign waving. They drew straws to determine the order in which they would compete. First, there was the talent competition, during which they were supposed to represent the Bahamas in some meaningful way. Contestant number 1 came out wearing a lobster costume that can be kindly described as homemade. I represent the lobster industry, she began. As she spewed out lobster statistics, her stuffed lobster arms and legs bounced up and down, giving the impression that she was waving to 8 people simultaneously. Contestant number 2 came out covered with a fisherman's net, adorned with seashells and fake kelp. She represented the ocean and all that it had to give. Contestant number 3 wore a diver's suit, complete with fins, and presented an ode to the coral. Contestant number 4 wore a flag of the Bahamas and sang a song that I assume was the national anthem. I had no idea what the song was supposed to sound like, although I was quite sure it wasn't supposed to sound like what I was hearing. Contestant number 5, dressed as the sun, wore a yellow leotard complete with a swim cap on which styrofoam rays of sunshine had been glued. She discussed the beautiful weather in the Bahamas, sharing statistics on the number of days of sunshine and inches of rain. The last contestant wore a blue dress and read a poem she had written about the ocean. You are blue, we love you, what would we do without you? By the end of that segment, I wished Scotty could beam me up. Instead, the swimsuit competition began. Swimsuit competitions go against everything that is right and decent in this world. We're told that beauty is on the inside and that who we are matters far more than what we look like. But could you please just put on this bikini and walk around on high heels so I can judge your inner beauty? I don't know which was worse, to be a contestant or a judge. I wanted to stand up on the table and tell the girls to take off their high heels and hurl them at the organizers of this event, demanding that the pageant be replaced by a spelling bee. Instead, I just sat there and prayed for the end. For the last part, the deep question segment, the girls had to answer a question drawn out of a hat. What would you do if you were selected as Miss Bahamas? If you could solve one problem, what would it be? I'd been hoping the questions would be more interesting. If you were to design a theme park around the crashed drug plane, what would you call it? Besides turtles, can you think of any other endangered species that we could cut up and fry? Finally, the judges were herded into a small room to discuss the contestants. The former Miss Bahamas, a stunning and intelligent woman, and the only person in the world who could wear a hat with large purple feathers and still look good, reminded us that we needed to pick someone who was articulate, since she felt that this was a major part of the pageant. Francois and I agreed with her. The Canadian had nothing to say. He apparently could not recall the previous 2 hours. The rest of us decided that the talent competition had not yielded a clear winner. The Canadian nodded. We decided to ignore the swimsuit competition, calling it irrelevant. The Canadian nodded. We then agreed that there was only one articulate contestant, and she should be the winner. The Canadian did not nod again because he had nodded off. We woke him up and went back into the auditorium, where once again we were greeted with cheers and screams and sign waving. Right then and there, I gave up all desire of ever becoming a rock star. It was just too loud. The girl we had selected was undoubtedly the underdog. She was quite overweight, she was the least physically attractive, and she had the smallest cheering section. She was, however, the most articulate. This may have been because she was considerably older than the other contestants and probably a repeater. The crowd's favorite was a girl named Chantal, who was by far the prettiest and the best looking in a bathing suit, but we were looking for depth, not beauty. As soon as the MC appeared, the crowd fell silent. People started huddling close together, anticipating the next opportunity to scream. The MC said a few words about how all the girls are so qualified and how hard it must have been to select just one. To a completely hushed audience, he then announced the runners-up, whom we had pretty much picked at random. There were 3 girls left. Everyone assumed the winner was Chantal. He then announced the winner. I can barely recall the next few moments because I was having a panic attack. The instant the winner's name was announced, everyone screamed, but this was not a joyous scream. This was a bad scream, the kind of scream that is usually emitted by mobs waving clubs and leads to eventual inclusion in history books. The audience was chanting, "No way, no way!" Chantal stood on stage crying. The winner and her mother, who looked just like her daughter but more overweight, came and thanked us. "We can't believe it," they said. Neither apparently could anybody else. François and I managed to get out of the auditorium, running all the way back to our hotel. "They're going to kill us," I said to François. "That's what you said about the mailboat," François said. We went into our room and started getting ready for bed, although I was quite sure I would not be sleeping much that night. "What's that noise?" I asked François. "What noise?" "Listen," I said. We could hear a distinct rumbling that was getting louder and louder. François opened the door, then immediately shut it. "It's nothing," he said. François has many talents, but lying is not one of them. By the time I got to the door, I could hear the distinct chanting of a large, angry crowd. "Judges paid off! Judges paid off!" The protest went on well into the night. I could not fall asleep, knowing that if the mobs stormed our dinky hotel room, my only weapon was a collection of conch shells. I tried to imagine how my parents would be contacted to claim our bodies. "It was a violent incident involving a beauty pageant," they would be told. It was a long night, during which my husband slept like a log. If I were a rich man. In Abadan, we never had to think about money, not because we were rich, but because the National Iranian Oil Company took care of all our needs. Employees received free furnished housing. The size and amenities were based on years of experience and education. Plumbing problems, electrical problems, and leaky roofs were fixed free of charge. Schools, doctors, and even buses cost nothing. For entertainment, everyone converged at the local clubhouse for bingo, swimming, movies, and concerts. Except for food, it was all free of charge. The club also held Persian New Year celebrations, Christmas parties, and even an annual bal masqué with an award given for best costume. My parents and Aunt Sedira and Uncle Abdullah always dressed up as villagers, and every year they didn't win. In 1957, an employee of the fire department won with his rendition of a spaceship passenger. As an engineer with a graduate degree, my father was entitled to a 3-bedroom house with a huge backyard, complete with a vegetable garden and chickens. Each day, I made my rounds, verifying whether the carrots, corn, radishes, or green beans were ready to eat. Afterward, I checked for insects, keeping track of all the creatures that shared our garden. My mother found my interest in bugs an odd and somewhat disturbing hobby for a little girl. My daughter shares that fascination with things that creep and crawl, and I tell her that a career in entomology awaits her. Our front yard in Abadan was filled with roses, jasmine, and narcissus. Next to the flower beds stood a large covered swing. Early evening, when the stifling heat lifted, we would sit outside on the swing, sipping cherry drinks or Pepsi and eating salted sunflower seeds. Our evenings were often punctuated with the sound of our neighbor's shrill voice, "Jimmy! Jimmy!" Her husband's name was not Jimmy, but Javad. But our neighbor had seen a few too many American movies and had decided to anglicize her husband's name, adding a bit of exoticism to our neck of the woods. Not to be outdone, we acquired a stray dog and named it Jimmy. And this is how, on any given evening, one could hear not one, but 2 families calling for their respective Jimmy. When we first came to America, not only did we have to adjust to paying for everything, the plumber charges for just looking at the problem, we had to pay with American currency. In 1972, $1 was worth 7 tumans, or 70 rials. This meant that a package of Oscar Mayer bologna cost not $2, but 14 tumans. Tomatoes were not 50 cents per pound, but 3.5 tumans. Nothing could be purchased without an automatic conversion to Iranian currency, followed by the requisite, "Ooh, that's a lot." Little did we know that what seemed expensive when we first came to America would appear to be a downright bargain after the Iranian Revolution. Political upheaval is rarely good for the economy. In 1979, the value of Iranian currency took a nosedive. $1 eventually was worth 800 tumans, or 8,000 rials. The $2 package of Oscar Mayer bologna now cost 1,600 tumans, the price of a small Persian rug before the revolution. Even Iranians who used to spend money freely now had to think twice before all purchases. My father has always been a thrifty man, but our financial problems after the revolution thrust him onto a new plane of existence, a universe with the motto, "I'll fix it myself." A white lab coat and stethoscope do not a doctor make, and a dozen trips to the Sears hardware department do not a handyman make. But short of drilling for oil or hunting squirrel, my father came to believe that he could take care of all his family's needs. His engineering background, combined with his Time Life Home Repair and Improvement, a 14-volume set, convinced him that he could address any leak, drip, rattle, or clog. Any objection or doubt we expressed led him to recount the story of how he had built a radio when he was a teenager. When challenged with the point that installing tile is perhaps different from building a radio, he would always reply, "Not really." Strolling through our house, one sees ample evidence of my father's can-do spirit. So what if the hot water comes out of the faucet marked cold? That's nothing compared to what a plumber would have charged to fix the sink. And the duct tape covering the holes in the kitchen wall, who's going to notice those? As for the way the wallpaper in the bathroom doesn't match, let's not get too picky. It's just a bathroom, not a dining room. Should Time Life publish a do-it-yourself guide to medical procedures, my mother and I will be leaving the country. If my father limited his handyman skills to his own humble abode, that would be fine. Unfortunately, Kazem Appleseed insists on sharing his gifts with the rest of us. Having fixed everything in his own house, he has moved on to his children's. My brother Farsi is an executive in a high-tech firm. Unlike our father, Farsi has no problem spending money. He pays someone to wash his car, someone to hem his pants, and someone to clean his house. Not only does he have all his clothes dry cleaned, he pays extra to have his laundry picked up and dropped off at his doorstep. During my parents' last visit to Farsi, our father initiated and completed a small project. After Farsi left for work, Kazem strolled to the hardware store and picked up a few items. He then spent the entire day spackling and painting. After 12 hours at work, my brother returned home to discover a blotchy pattern on all the walls of his 24th floor penthouse. "What is this?" "Try to find a crack or hole," my father challenged him. "I covered them all. There were a lot." "Who asked you to do this?" my brother asked incredulously. "Where did you get this paint? It's an entirely different color from my walls." "It's fine if you don't thank me, but for your information, white paint is white paint," my father replied. Seizing an opportunity to avenge a few of her own home repair memories, my mother chimed in, "I told him not to do it. He didn't listen. He never listens." "Well," my father exclaimed indignantly, preparing us for the aphorism he uses like a maraschino cherry to top off all his unappreciated repair projects, "a man standing next to a river cannot appreciate water." Luckily for my father, we weren't standing next to a river. Someone might have ended up in it. When my husband and I bought a condominium, we invited my parents for a visit. Our home was spanking new, which meant there was nothing to repair. After a few hours, however, my father announced, "You need a medicine cabinet in the bathroom." "We don't need a medicine cabinet in the bathroom," we replied. "I think you do." said my father, sounding undeterred. "We don't need one, we don't want one." My father, like a cat, should not be left indoors for 8 hours. Marking his territory, he purchased and installed a medicine cabinet in our bathroom while my husband and I were at work. Perhaps if it hadn't been hung crooked, François would not have been so upset. During his next visit, my father secretly decided that our bathroom needed towel hooks. Using nails that were too long, my father pierced the door, creating towel hooks on one side, medieval blinding devices on the other. My husband has since taken the situation into his own hands, hiding all our screwdrivers and hammers before my parents' visit. My father has never apologized for any of his handyman missteps, insisting instead that our lack of appreciation stems from deeper issues. "If I had charged you $1,000 for spackling and painting, you'd think it looked better," he told Fashid. He regularly tells my mother that her complaints about holes left in walls and mismatched tiles only reveal her desire to impress others, a quality that she needs to change. When my husband complained that the medicine cabinet we never wanted in the first place was crooked, my father replied, "It still holds things." His ability not to apologize for glaring mistakes would have served him well in another venue, perhaps politics. It has taught us never to complain about any problem in the house, lest my father decide to fix it. No matter how inconvenient a household malfunction might be, Kazem can always make it worse, for free. Just as my father cannot envision actually calling a plumber for a clogged sink, he cannot understand why people eat in restaurants. For him, eating out means going to one of his sister's houses, where not only is the food fresh, delicious, and served by people who love him and laugh at his jokes, but there is no bill at the end. Going to a real restaurant with my father always means the same thing. The chicken is $12? Does that mean we get the whole chicken? Let's see. They have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 20 tables here. 4 people per table average, each ordering the chicken dish. Let's say 3 seatings per evening. Multiply that by 802 months. Geez, I should have opened a restaurant. These calculations never include the costs of actually running a restaurant, just the supposed profits. Needless to say, we never dare order drinks with my father, since a $2.50 glass of lemonade, which requires at maximum 3 lemons at 10 cents each, plus a little sugar multiplied by 802 months, we always drink water. Tap, of course, since bottled water would most certainly lead to a whole other lecture, beginning with how he grew up drinking the water in Ahvaz and is none the worse for it, and you can multiply that by 800. Like a caterpillar morphing into a butterfly, my father magically transforms into Daddy Warbucks as soon as he sets foot in Iran. This is because in Iran, my father is a millionaire. During their annual visits, he and my mother stay at the former Sheraton in Tehran, a hotel they could have never afforded without a complete devaluation of Iranian currency. Each year, my relatives in Iran, a country whose people are known for hospitality, beg my parents to stay with them, but my father refuses, explaining that staying in a suite is not something he can afford anywhere else. The relatives come and visit him, and he treats them all to lavish restaurant meals, leaving huge tips for all the employees. Once my father accepted that his monthly pension from 33 years of employment with the National Iranian Oil Company would buy him only a few restaurant meals in America, he decided to turn it around and do something good with the money in Iran. Every year, he withdraws the pension and donates it to the needy. He is paid for surgeries, numerous medical treatments, eyeglasses, and medicine. About 10 years ago, he met 3 children who had lost both parents and were living with their elderly grandparents. Every year, he supplies them with clothes, books, and toys. Before his last trip, he asked me if I could give him my laptop for the son. "I'm using it to write a book," I told him. "Give it to me when you're done," my father replied. Last year, he bought desperately needed car parts for a man who makes his living as a driver and who without his car would have had no job. The year before, he paid for extensive repairs to a home inhabited by a family of 9. Luckily for them, my father did not have his Time Life series with him. Every year, my father returns to America with a suitcase full of pistachios and a head full of stories. He describes the luxuries of staying in a suite and ordering room service and making sure that the cleaning lady receives the biggest tip of her career. He tells me how odd it is for him to be treated with such fanfare in his own country and how everyone considers him to be such a big shot, all because of a pension that means almost nothing here. After his last trip, I asked him if it was hard to return to America, where he is far from wealthy. But Firuze, he said, I'm a rich man in America too. I just don't have a lot of money. Afterword, Kazem and Nazire Jazoyeri. Since the publication of Funny in Farsi, I am asked one question more than any other. How did your family react to the book? The first person I called when I started writing my memoir was Mrs. Sandberg, my second-grade teacher. It may seem odd that I have kept up with her all these years, but I, like malaria, stay in the system forever. Mrs. Sandberg, thankfully, did not ask me, as many people did, who my memoir was about, proving that she knew the meaning of memoir. She also did not ask me the second most common inquiry. What in your life are you writing about? It is true that most people write a memoir after an achievement. I, however, skipped the achievement part and moved straight to the memoir. This is because I truly believe that everyone has a story and everyone's story counts. You don't have to win a Nobel, be a supermodel, or be involved in a scandal to have an interesting story, although any of those things, alone or in combination, would guarantee more media coverage. I am still hoping for either a Nobel or a minor scandal involving me in a non-scandalous way, just enough to get me on the front pages on a slow news day. When I told Mrs. Sandberg that I was writing a book, she was ecstatic, claiming that she always knew that I would do something unique in the world. At this point in the conversation, we were interrupted by some muffled noise in the background. Mrs. Sandberg said that her husband, Art, was claiming that he had been the first to make that prediction. Mrs. Sandberg, in her gentle yet firm second-grade teacher way, reminded Art that no, it indeed had been she who had first seen the glimmer of hope beyond my initial 7 words of English. When the book was published, I sent her a signed copy to my favorite American and immediately received a message on my answering machine. Firuze, that was the loveliest, sob sob. I can't describe, sob sob. I'll call you later. My extended biological family, those whose English allowed them to read the book, loved it and agreed that I had very accurately captured the different personalities. Not surprisingly, they also had their comments. My oldest uncle, Mohammed, was very upset that I had not used my maiden name. His reaction was not so much out of pride as because his son had recently opened a plastic surgery office in Southern California, and having our last name on a book could translate into many facelifts. My cousin's wife, Azar, was very upset that I had mentioned one of her sons, Mahan, but not the other, Human. My uncle Nematullah asked that I leave him out of my next book. Instead, he requested that I write about his 2 sons, Ali and Javad, both currently in dental school and single. My mother's English prevented her from reading the book. I did, however, let her know what I had written. She gave me her blessing, but had a few questions. Did you mention that I never left you with a babysitter even though I could have? Did you mention that I nursed you for over 2 years and how difficult you were to wean? Did you mention how I was always at home when you returned from school, that you never came home to an empty house? Although none of the above made it into the book, any mother who gives her blessing to a memoir that mocks her accent has the right to tell the world that I was a pain to wean. And this brings me to the main character in my book, my father. When I started writing my stories, I had no idea that my father would figure so prominently. Often, I would start a story about myself, and by the time I was finished, it was about my father. How this happened, I do not know. When I first told my parents that I was writing stories about my life, their reaction can be summarized in one word. Oh. This is why I called Mrs. Sandberg first. My parents' reaction, however, must be placed in the context of my past. I am a serial hobbyist. It started in 5th grade when I discovered how to order things from the back of comic books. Most of my purchases, Sea Monkeys being the exception, were under $5, so my father happily wrote the checks. He assumed that my new interest gave me something in common with American kids. It didn't. I just liked receiving packages in the mail. Spyglasses, patches, decals, joke books, an array of cheap, useless paraphernalia gathered dust in my closet. The items never lived up to their descriptions, but that didn't stop me. The U.S. Army, however, did. It all began and ended with a seemingly innocent ad for a free U.S. Army cap. All I had to do was fill out a form with some basic information. I also had to be 18, but that struck me as a minor detail. I simply changed my birth date, and 4 weeks later, I was the proud owner of a U.S. Army cap, adorned with a large American flag. Before I could enjoy my newest acquisition, we started receiving phone calls from recruiters who were interested in talking to me about joining the military. Even though I had lied about my age, my first foray into criminal life was obviously flawed by my having given my correct phone number. My mother feigned ignorance with the callers, which, given her English, was not a far stretch, but these people were not discouraged by a confused immigrant. Finally, after the 10th successive call during dinner time, my father took the phone and explained that I was only 11 and didn't want to join the Army as much as I wanted the cap. The recruiter was not happy to hear this and explained to my father that since I had lied to the government, I had technically committed a crime, and that this was very serious, and just this once they would let it go. I was no longer allowed to order anything. My dad did, however, let me keep the cap, seeing no value in throwing away a perfectly good accessory. Several years later, I donated it to the Salvation Army, its memory having been tarnished by the nightmares I experienced every time I looked at it. Had my mother not flushed my Sea Monkeys down the toilet while I was at school, I might never have moved on to my next hobby, sewing. My parents were so thrilled that I had taken up a normal hobby, one that did not involve pushy people making phone calls asking my whereabouts, that they even bought me a sewing machine. I pursued my new hobby with vigor, quickly filling my closet with my own creations. My sewing career reached its nadir with my 8th grade graduation dress, a multi-tiered ruffled creation adorned with yards and yards of eyelet and periwinkle blue and pink satin ribbons. This was topped with a brimmed straw hat bought from JCPenney that I decorated with matching pastel ribbons tied in a bow. 25 years later, my daughter found the dress and asked if she could use it for Halloween. "I can be Little Bo Peep," she exclaimed. My sewing career came to an abrupt halt when my cousin Shahrukh asked me to hem his pants. His request, coupled with the realization that my clothes were really ugly, ended what could have been a career in fashion design. I sold the sewing machine and moved on to knitting. I learned to knit 3 items: mufflers, booties with decorative pom-poms, and shawls with extensive fringing. What I lacked in variety, I made up for in quantity. I knitted gifts for all my relatives, none of whom ever wore them. Granted, Southern California's year-round summer weather is not conducive to the wearing of knit scarves, and the last time anyone wore a fringed shawl, Betsy Ross was still sewing her flag, but still, once the gifts were opened, they were never seen again. This indifferent reaction to my creations choked my woolen muse. I moved on to a whole new hobby involving a recipe for a salty dough that, when baked in the oven for hours, created permanently useless objects perfect for cluttering shelves. I discovered this hobby around the holidays. My friend Lori was using it to make Christmas tree decorations. Faced with the decorative limitations of my Muslim household, I decided to make wreaths for my extended family. Wreaths, I reasoned, added a festive touch without implying that the family had abandoned its native ways and would be roasting a pig in the backyard on the 25th. I increased the recipe exponentially, necessitating the purchase of pounds and pounds of salt and flour. The wisdom of supersizing the tchotchkes came into question as soon as the first wreath emerged from the oven. It weighed 40 pounds. Having already purchased industrial quantities of the ingredients, I felt I had no option but to continue. I mixed, I kneaded, I baked, I painted. 7 days and 7 wreaths later, I was done. The first, second, and third recipients of my holiday cheer showed the same facial expression, bewilderment coupled with lower back strain. The other 4 never received theirs, thanks to my mother, who said, "Don't hand out the rest." With my muse almost choked, but still gasping for air, I moved on to my next hobby, baking desserts. Familial intervention stepped in again. "Stop baking, we're getting fat." My photography phase was met with equal glee. "Stop taking our picture." Not appreciative of my candid shots, mom getting out of bed, parents having an argument, dad asleep on the sofa. My parents forced me to turn to nature as a model. 4 rolls of black and white photos of leaves on the ground, and I was ready to move on. My painting phase should have been far more appreciated and nurtured, as evidenced by my skill in the self-portrait that depicted a smiling old woman and was entitled "Me on the Inside." My parents said it didn't look like me. Had Picasso been in my family, he would have ended up an accountant. When engineering is considered exciting, there isn't much room for a painting of a dancing banana, like the one I made for my cousin Ali and never saw again. Mine is a family with one successful author, my cousin Mehdi, whose book, Process-Centered Software Engineering Environments, is everyone's favorite, although no one in the family, with the possible exception of Mehdi himself, has read it. With my muse dead and buried, I moved on to college, marriage, and motherhood. This explains why 2 decades after my last hobby, when I announced that I was writing stories, my parents were speechless. When I found an agent, they didn't react. When I got a contract with Random House, they showed no reaction. "You have heard of Random House, haven't you?" I asked. "No," they replied. "It's a very big deal," I told them. 1 month later, I received a phone call from my father, out of breath with excitement. "What's that place called that wants your stories?" he asked. "Random House," I told him. "They're huge!" he exclaimed. My father had apparently been watching a Tom and Jerry cartoon with my niece, or the other way around, and one of the characters was reading a book published by Random Mouse. Seeing the publishing house mentioned in a cartoon was a watershed moment. From that day on, my dad was very excited. Daily phone calls ensued. "Make sure you mention that I bought a condo in Newport Beach. Did I ever tell you about the time I flunked a guy even though he offered me a bribe? Do you have 15 minutes? I just remembered a story. The last chapter should be about me." When the stories were finished, I let him read them. He loved them all, except for one, America, Land of the Free. "That chapter makes me look cheap," he complained. "Enjoying freebies is a universal experience," I assured him. Displaying his usual generosity of spirit, he agreed to let the story stay if it's important to the book. He did complain, however, that he now felt self-conscious at Price Club. "There are no pictures in this book, are there?" The book was completed in the summer of 2002 and was slated for release the following summer. My father did not like this. "If it's finished, why do we have to wait so long?" I explained the marketing process, the publishing seasons, the importance of releasing books during the summer season. After every explanation, my dad wanted to know why they weren't releasing it now. Whenever the Middle East was in the news, which was often, my dad would call. Call Random House and tell them they are making a big mistake. Your book should be out now. Who makes these decisions at Random House? Why can't they at least publish it for Christmas? It makes more sense. 6 months before the publication, he called me in the middle of the day, screaming into the phone, "You've sold 1.5 million copies." I very calmly asked him why he was saying this. I went on Amazon and it says sales rank 1,497,000. He was still yelling into the receiver. Listen, Baba, I said. The sales rank is where my book is compared to the #1 bestseller. 1.5 million is the bottom of the barrel. Plus, given that my book is not even published, why would you think that I would sell any, let alone 1.5 million copies? I only heard a tiny, defeated voice on the other end of the line. Oh. A few months prior to publication, my book started being reviewed and mentioned on radio and on the internet. This led to a change in ranking. With my book reaching the low 40,000s, my father was ecstatic. He started keeping a journal with the date, the time, and my ranking. Yesterday at 10 in the morning, it was 46,789. Today at 10, it's 42,857. It's going crazy. Of course, when my ranking went in the wrong direction, he got very upset. What's it doing at 67,432? He asked me at 7:30 in the morning as I was trying to get my kids ready for school. He now has a small notebook filled with what is possibly the world's most useless information. I have tried to discourage him from this newfound hobby, but my dad is undeterred, insisting that he wants to remember this period in his life forever. In his attempts to broaden my father's use of the computer beyond Amazon.com, my brother Farsi taught my father how to look me up on internet search engines. My father has since devoted his retirement years to reading articles about me and tracking all information about my book. There's a library in Maine that carries your book, he told me one day. You should call them and thank them. He loves reading reviews, since most have been very kind. Hell, however, hath no fury like my father's for the reviewer who didn't love my book. Who is Publishers Weekly? My irate father asked one day. You need to call them and tell them they don't know anything. When the book was finally published, my father was upset about one thing. You should have used our last name, he complained. I reminded him that he was the reason I had not. What did I know? He said. He and my mother spent the first month after publication going from bookstore to bookstore, just looking at the book. I made them promise, however, not to accost any shoppers. For my book tour, I invited my parents to come to Northern California to hear me at my local bookstore. I will come under one condition, my father said. Do not introduce us. The entire day before my book signing, my father reminded me that they did not want to be introduced under any circumstances. Don't worry, I said. The evening is about me. 10 minutes before getting into the car, my mother said, I want to be introduced. Forget it, I said. Over 200 people showed up for the reading. My parents sat in the 4th row. When the store manager introduced me, I glanced at my mother. She was already crying. I never once looked at my father for fear that I would start laughing and never stop. After the reading, someone in the audience asked me how my parents feel about the book. They loved it, I said, and were in fact in the audience, but did not want to be introduced. So if you see a man old enough to be my father who looks just like me, it's a coincidence, I added. When the event was over, a crowd gathered around my parents. I could hear my father holding court. I am going to sue her. I'm going to sue her. On the way home, my mother said that was the best night of her life. My father said he wanted Steve Martin to play him in the movie. When my father found out that I was writing one last story for the paperback, he insisted I add an explanation. He said, when I went on Bowling for Dollars, every contestant had brought his own bowling ball except for me. I had to use someone else's, and it was much too heavy. That's why I bowled so poorly. That's okay, I told him. I won the jackpot with that story.